Hi, my name is Rico Canero, and I'm the author of a book called Runaway Virgins, Danish West Indian Slave Ads, 1770 to 1848. I was inspired to write this book in doing research on my own family ancestry in the Virgin Islands, which goes back to the late 1700s. I was able to find lots of good information. However, for those ancestors of mine that were involved in slavery, as in slaves, there was not much information that I could find hardly anywhere. Matter of fact, most of the census records, property records, things like that would list just the name of an individual, maybe their occupation or their age, or maybe how much that particular plantation owner assessed the value of that person to be. Now, much information was not to be found anywhere. However, I stumbled across some slave ads, some runaway slave ads. And what I learned is that whenever a slave would run away, the owner of that particular slave would place ads in the newspaper describing as much detail as they could about the individual they were looking for, with hopes of having that person returned or found. So in the book, Runaway Virgins, I incorporated about 250 of these such slave ads to help tell the story of that part of my ancestry, which for the most part is lost to history, but to still get a sense of what life may have been like for them. So some of the things I'll share with you is that there were numerous slave ads showing incoming slaves being imported. So it says there 150 prime Gold Coast slaves, 174, 290. It was a regular occurrence for shipments of slaves to come into the different ports in on the island of St. Croix. A lot would also come to the island of St. Thomas, but the particular newspapers that I pulled from specifically listed St. Croix. Now, not much was known about where these particular slaves came from. However, many of the slaves wore scarifications. And if you have any friends or anyone from Africa, you'll notice that they still, a lot of times today, will wear different markings on their face to indicate what tribes they were from. In a lot of the slave ads, you can see that they had different markings on their bodies to indicate that they were Mandingo or Ibu or Mandinka or wherever parts of Africa that they may have been originating from. Now, one of the things that's also very interesting is that in the ads, and I have one here in particular for a young lady, and this is a good example. It talks about her name being Eba, and that she could speak several languages: English, French, Spanish, Dutch. It also talks about her being like a good cook and things like that. So you give a good description. It talks about her having a scar under one eye. Things like that was really helpful in identifying the individual and oftentimes, where they may have come from. Now, in looking at the various ads, in particular for the runaway individuals, sometimes you'll come across stories of, well, not even sometimes, but very often you'll come across women fleeing from bondage with their young children. Some of the stories talk about them running away with like up to 5 little children. And you can imagine how much of a handful that must have been trying to flee, not just with yourself, trying to find freedom, but then also taking small children with you. And there's this one ad here about a woman named Mimba who was last seen clutching a small child in her arms. And that's very, heart-wrenching to even just have that visual in your mind of someone, setting out, trying to find freedom for themselves and their child, not knowing what's out there. Whether they were going to try to hide in the bushes somewhere, or whether they were going to try to get a hold of a small boat to try to flee to a nearby island, or in the case of slaves on St. John, sometimes they just swam to the island of Tortola seeking that freedom. But either way, just a very, very hard thing for people to endure. Slavery, for the most part, in the Virgin Islands lasted about 150 years. And if you can imagine a period, the late 1600s up until the late 1700s, about 75-year period, it was very harsh. A lot like the things you would see on the TV miniseries Roots or some of the other documentaries you will learn about slavery in the Americas. But then the second half of slavery, the period, like say 1792 up until 1848, it was very different. And mostly because the end of the slave trade meant that the supply of slaves was going to be cut dramatically. So in order to get replacement slaves, it was not going to be as easy as it was before. So the whole dynamic between slave and slave master changed dramatically, because prior to the end of the slave trade, you could be very harsh to a slave and they really had no recourse. But after the abolishment of the slave trade, you knew that you had limited slaves. And what happened is, if you were the overseer of a particular plantation and you had, say, 10 slaves, if 3 of them ran away, the owner, who may be some well-to-do person off in Copenhagen, Denmark somewhere, they don't care that 3 of them ran away. They just want the production to continue, whether you're shorthanded or not. So things changed quite a bit. The biggest change is that they started really enforcing the hunting of the slaves to get them to come back. Oftentimes they had to travel to different islands to get the slaves back, from Puerto Rico, from Antigua, St. Martin, wherever they may have fled to. And here's a section here that I have talking about the slave hunters. And it was very important to be able to maintain the slaves that you did have. And there's recent stories about police officers having a history in the slave capture or slave hunter business, and that's not really true. For the most part, police have always been police and slave hunters have been slave hunters. Slave hunters were pretty much just people in the community that every so often would be recruited to go out and help round up any slave that may be away from their plantation. Now, I have a long list here and another list here of individuals that were caught during some of these roundups. And they would hold them at the different forts, whether Fort Frederick in Fredericksdale or Fort Christian, Vernon, Fort Christian. And then the owners would come to claim the slaves that we would have captured. Of course, areas like the Free Gut area, if slaves had ran away to those areas, it was a lot harder to get them to come back because people just wouldn't tell. So they would keep it as a secret and help to protect the people from fleeing. Now, one of the other things is to keep them from running away, they would have different like chains or things around their necks. And then you see here a little whip and an axe. The whip would have been incorporated as punishment, but the axe not so much, more so for probably threatening. And then little devices like this to force your mouth open, to force feed you. Unlike in the movie Roots, where they cut off half of Kunta Kinte's foot for running away, that would rarely, if ever, happen in the Virgin Islands, just because it did you absolutely no good to injure your slave, because then you didn't have someone else to work. So the bottom line was getting the work done, getting the sugarcane harvested, and getting it done in a timely manner to ultimately turn a profit. Now, pardons were another big way of getting slaves to return. And oftentimes, ads would be placed, like, say, for example, this lady named Sylvia, and she ran away, say, 3 months ago. All masters of vessels or ship captains and are notified that if they see her, to return her, and should she return upon her own accord within a fortnight, she will be pardoned completely. And what they were saying there is that if she comes back, we'll kind of pretend like none of this ever happened, just kind of go back to work. And this was a very popular thing. Many instances of people being pardoned, and actually quite a few slave ads saying that if you come back, not only will I pardon you and not punish you, I will afford you the opportunity to select whichever master you want to work for on the island, and we'll just do a trade. So you'll go work over there and they'll get somebody that's willing to come and work for me. So like I say, the owner-slave dynamic changed dramatically once there was a scarcity of slaves to choose from. So some of the other ads that are really interesting: slaves that were owned by other blacks, which is a very common thing. Now, blacks oftentimes would purchase slaves to free family members and husbands and wives and things like that. But also there's at least 3 instances that I found where people just basically purchased blacks because you needed them to work on your plantation. Now, with that being said, there was also instances of them running away. So it was not a perfect scenario where, okay, a black person freed me, things are going to be good. Even in that case, a lot of times people sought freedom. So one really, really interesting ad I found here from the bank, and it lists all the different deposits for that particular month. And right here, it lists 8 deposits from unfree individuals. So in 1806, there's a thing here showing that at least 8 different slaves had bank accounts, which is pretty shocking when you think about it, but they had money and they had to safeguard their money, so they kept it in a bank just like anyone else. For slaves that were free, they had to wear a red and white cockade, kind of like a little ribbon to indicate that you were a free person. But that system didn't last very long, because in addition to that and a letter stating that you were free, many of the slaves had learned how to read and write. So what would happen was they would simply just make their own passes, and you couldn't tell who was free and who was slave. So it just kind of made everything a moot point. It was hard to tell who was who, especially with so many blacks being free. Now, I have certain ads that were interesting for different slaves that were runaway. There was one slave named Moko that ran away, and it's specifically listed here that he shoots well, indicating that he was a skilled marksman with a rifle. So the fact that he had regular access to a gun is something that you would never see in the United States. However, if you were an elderly plantation owner and you wanted to eat deer or pheasant or whatever, you needed someone that could shoot well. And here you go, you got a slave that can shoot well. Also, you had slaves that owned gold. You have slaves that were basically white people that were enslaved that would run away. Bottom line is they had to get the work done. So by any means necessary, the work was going to get done. Last section I'm going to touch on here. These are a whole list of individuals that have been freed for one reason or another. Most of the times people are set free is because they lifelong work for an individual who was appreciative for the work, or sometimes in their will they would say, upon my passing such and such gets free. The sad thing about that ad that I showed you, those are all the people that their paperwork was not completed, so they're not formally free yet, or that their taxes were never paid, so that they almost immediately return back into slavery. Regardless, a lot of good information I learned in doing this research for my book, Runaway Virgins, Danish West Indian Slave Ads, 1770 to 1848. I learned a lot about myself, a lot about Virgin Islands history, a lot about slavery in the Danish West Indies. Great book. I hope you appreciate my work, and do check it out. Thank you.